working now. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome yet once again to Victoria Memorial Hall and to the beautiful setting here at the Western Quadrangle for yet another lecture that promises to be as fascinating as the ones we have had in recent times. And we have Irwin Allan going to tell us about the man with the Sola Topi. Before he gets on with his talk, I would like to request Dr. Jayanti Sengupta, Secretary and Curator, Victoria Memorial Hall, to welcome the audience here.
Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to tonight's talk on the man with the Sola Topi by the very distinguished Indian author in English, Irwin Allan, whom it's an honor to host in the Victoria Memorial Hall. And we will really miss him in the Kolkata Literary Meet, which we are starting from the 25th of this month, but we hope that he will be back maybe next year to speak at the Kolkata Literary Meet in 2018. But tonight he is with us and he is going to speak on this fascinating subject where he explores the relationship between Anglo-Indian identity and matters related to dress and clothing. And he will speak, as I understand, on the complicated relationships between Britishness and Anglo-Indianness, as well as the relationship and the complicated interrelationships between race and class. It's great it's an absolute privilege and honor to have him here to speak on this. And this lecture is actually the concluding lecture of an international workshop titled Nexus, Anglo-Indian Life and Anglo-Indian Literature, which was hosted by Jadavpur University over yesterday and today. This is the concluding session. And it's a privilege to organize this lecture in association with the School of Women's Studies, Jadavpur University, and the New Zealand India Research Institute. So it's a collaborative effort, and the coordinator of the School of Women's Studies in Jadavpur University, my friend Professor Shomita Sen, is here. Also Dr. Andrew Robinson, right? Sorry, Robin Andrews, sorry. Professor Robin Andrews from Massey University in New Zealand is also here. And I would really invite both of them, or maybe at least one of them, to address this audience about the workshop which we are concluding with Allan Seeley's lecture. The workshop that took place in Jadavpur University over yesterday and today. And it's very apt that we are having this concluding session of that workshop here in the Victoria Memorial Hall under the watchful eyes of Warren Hastings. And so it's a great pleasure to invite Professor Shomita Sen or Robin to come here and address the audience about the workshop.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm a New Zealander, and it's how we usually greet an audience. I've been here for the last couple of months, and the last 2 days have been a really exciting coming together of both Anglo-Indian, people who have written fantastic Anglo-Indian literature, Allan Seeley and Keith Butler, and a number of scholars, all Indian-based, who are using Anglo-Indian literature to look at Anglo-Indian life, Anglo-Indian history, making connections between the two. There are people from history, from cultural studies, from English departments. Over the last 2 days we've had some wonderful discussions which began with the inauguration where Professor Suranjandas of the VC of Jadavpur University inaugurated and started with a wonderful speech which we felt so honoured that he had that he knew so much about the topic, had made a point of knowing so much about the topic. The next speaker at the inauguration was Professor Shekhar Bandapadiye, who's the director of the New Zealand India Research Institute, and he was here 2 days ago as well. So there's some nice connections. And there were discussions on identity, on food, on literature, on how much literature and life intersect. We've also had the privilege of having Dr. Neil Hall with us, who gave us wonderful poetry this morning for an hour, which was a treat and made us all think too, because he's an activist and he made us look at our consciences and think about the social situations and prejudice and stereotyping and marginalisation. There are issues that were covered in the conference in other ways, so we feel really buoyed up with ideas and challenges to the challenges to Anglo-Indian stereotypes is something we need and we want to pursue. We've got another day at Calcutta University tomorrow where these issues will be discussed as well. Calcutta University has the only collection of Anglo-Indian works anywhere in the world. The Derozio Centre in the library in College Street. So the day seminar tomorrow is really a continuation of the themes of the last few days. I won't take up any more time because I'm also dying to hear Allan Seeley today. Shumita Sen would also like to speak.
I just wanted to say one thing, and that is to thank Dr. Jayanta Sengupta, the curator of Victoria Memorial, on behalf of the coordinators for responding readily to the suggestion to have this final lecture at this absolutely superlative venue. I think this setting in many ways rounds off this international workshop in a way that could have never been possible in the university. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming today.
Before we invite Allan Seeley up to the lectern, may I request Jayanta Sengupta to please hand over a memento on behalf of Victoria Memorial Hall, because usually after the lecture there's so much excitement and so many questions and answers that we tend to overlook and forget that very pleasant duty. So we would like to do it right now. So it's right here. Yeah.
Well, to this audience, Irwin Allan Seeley needs no introduction. He's a star. And I will not waste any time to introduce him. I'll just speak a couple of lines about him, which is already known to everybody. Irwin Allan Seeley is the author of the globally celebrated The Trotternama, a comic epic on Anglo-Indian life and history, and also other novels. In recent years, he has turned also to non-fiction. The Small Wild Goose Pagoda, which was published by Aleph in 2014, is a natural and social history of a plot of land in Dehradun where he lives. His most recent work is the China Sketchbook, which was published by Seagull in 2016. And his latest book, which is due out this year, 2017, is titled Zilaldinas, a cycle of poems on Fatehpur Sikri. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Irwin Allan Sibi.
The shawl is in case my teeth start to chatter. A little bit cold. I'd like to thank Robin and Shomita for inviting me here, and the Victoria Memorial, and also the New Zealand India Research Institute for supporting the show. It's always a pleasure for me to return to Calcutta. I'm essentially a small town boy. The first time I came to this city, I was a young man, 20 years old, and I came here to sing on Park Street. And here I am, 45 years later, still singing for my supper. I have been confined to my room for the last couple of days, so I must confess that I didn't attend many of the sessions, but I have read each one of the abstracts, and I will follow up, and I hope that the papers are collected and so that I can have the book on my shelf. One of the presenters I met yesterday told me that she had spent 6 years immersed in the community, and that she felt like she was now an Anglo-Indian. I think that was Shamashri. So welcome to the tribe. And what a contrast with the Olympian posturing of someone like Nirad Chaudhry. The two completely different approaches to the subject of Anglo-Indians. A woman's guess is nearer than a man's certainty. My wife enjoys quoting this to me. Kipling, believe it or not. And in view of the notion of research as a kind of immersion in the community that one is studying, I'd like to splice a few paragraphs onto the subject of the man in the Sola Topi from an earlier piece that I wrote, which was called simply The Anglo-Indians. This was an afterword that I wrote for a book of photographs by a well-known photographer, Dilip Prakash, a friend of mine, on this subject, in which each photograph and each subject, as you turn the page, looks back at you and presents himself, not as a community, but as an individual. The Anglo-Indians. The Anglo-Indians are the first modern Indians. I would like to repeat that first sentence. The Anglo-Indians are the first modern Indians. Before the Victorian Hindu Renaissance, before the Nawabi itch for things European, before the Frankish musings of the great Mughal, there appears this already committed community of westernizers who will speak the father's tongue and yet eat the mother's salt. The first mother, and I'm simply imagining her, and this goes back to a topic that was raised by, I think, one of the early speakers yesterday, of imagination and history. How much of each can you tolerate? The first mother, imagine her, must have felt this alien child move in her and wondered at the future she contained. Would the child look like her? She must have asked. Or like the father, that pale ravisher, unlike any she had known. Or might it be a mixture of the two? Or something else again? The first births across the land would have been fraught but novel events. As the novelty wore off, practicalities would have arisen. Who would pay for the child's keep? What would he wear? Might the father be persuaded to acknowledge his child? If not, to take it on, at least to take an interest in its progress. But very likely the father had disappeared, moved on with his regiment, or his ship, or his convoy. And every so often, in the streets of any city, there might appear this startling cuckoo, a fair-skinned child in native clothes. Let a generation pass by. During this time, such children would have been raised by the mother, if not taken on by an interested father. But lately, by an order of state, military orphanages have been instituted that take in such offspring regardless of their color. Here, the children are housed and taught by the East India Company. They eat with knives and forks, not always a diet that the father or the mother would approve. They wear hats. They study, they play, and they quarrel in the foreign tongue. There is no record of their dreams, but we might fairly guess that whatever their imagery, they are already in English. Now, let 7 years pass. The child who was brought in is educated and ready to step out into the world. If it is a young man, he will very likely become what is known as a writer, or as we would say today, a clerk, keeping books for the company. But he would just as easily, if he were a ready outdoors man, become a soldier or a surveyor in the same honorable service. A young woman of marriageable age will immediately find a husband from among the European community, where there is no shortage of reluctant bachelors. A European complexion would be an asset, but a dark skin would not be necessarily a liability, for she would meet all the other expectations of language, religion, customs, and habits of a prospective husband. Given the high mortality rate among the company officers, she might even find herself widowed and remarried within the short space of the dreaded 2 monsoons, which was all a resident European in the field was rumored to expect in a cholera-ridden land. It would of course be tempting for her to reach as high as she could among her suitors, and this might see her absorbed into European society without a trace of her origins. It would be harder for the male, especially the dark-skinned male, to compete, in spite of his hat. But the school leavers might equally marry for love, one of his or her own kind, and set up a home in the European manner. In this way, a new community, next to but apart from the Europeans, takes shape. In the early years, they are called East Indians. I never worked out why and where that East Indian came from. But that is what the Anglo-Indians of De Rosio's time chose to call themselves, the East Indians, just as we now say Anglo-Indians. Within less than 2 generations, we find a distinct group of Indians, for all practical purposes a caste, existing in as yet easy proximity to the colonizing race, and distinct from the remainder of the population. The East Indians, by virtue of their color spectrum, merge with Europeans at the fair end of the scale and with their own darks at the other end. Even when the fair go to the fair and the dark to the dark, such is the nature of genes that neither can be at all certain of the color of their progeny. This may cause anxious moments in the 9th month, similar to those experienced by our hypothetical first mother. But popular novelists have tended to overstate the neuroses involved. Already by the middle of the 18th century, the great majority are marrying among themselves without the slightest thought for the color of their offspring. This is in itself a trait so modern that most other Indians have still to acquire it in the 21st century. Fair and lovely. It is not their only modern. Unlike the great mass of their countrymen, the new community expect and offer no dowry. They do not favor sons or lament daughters or stigmatize widows. They are largely educated to varying degrees and effect, and unless destitute, are imbued with civic notions well beyond the mainstream. In religion, they follow their fathers and are as pious as any other group in a pious land. But here, the shoe is on the other foot. Unlike the others, they lack a book. A holy book of their very own, as opposed to one that they share with their fathers. You know, it's often asked, Parsis, small community, how did they manage? The Parsis had a book of their own and of their very own. The Sikhs have a book of their own. We had a book that we shared. And this made all the difference. Any book might have sufficed, so long as it was theirs and theirs alone. But faith, in faith, as in language, they are covenanted. Just as the language they share with the rulers will both guarantee them jobs and keep them dependent, the shared faith is another article of indenture. They will be loyal subjects in this world because even in the next, they are in effect one with the master, only less so. They are bound to him as a shadow to the man. If in manners and morals the latest Indians modeled themselves scrupulously on the English, it was an imitation not craven or servile, but occasioned willy-nilly by the vacuum into which a new thing falls. There was no, or no recent precedent for the overlapping of Europe and Asia. And any group that sprang from it had to return to either the one or the other for its cultural ballast. Anglo-Indians chose the more modern of the two, a choice which other Indians are happy to repeat today. As British rule was consolidated, the many European surnames, Portuguese, French, German, Spanish, Italian, were simply markers of origin. One language and its ethos united the community, English. So when they spoke of home, they were not being ridiculous. The country that they had never seen was the source of all that they valued deeply, while in the only language they spoke, the word India was itself still foreign. Their very persons, their lived experience, domesticated both words. They embodied the worlds they stood for. They were foreign and yet native, native and yet foreign. And in that vexed identity lay their double fate. Okay, so now on to the man in the Sola Topi. Clothes make the man. They can also unmake him. In uncertain times, what you put on in the morning might just prove your undoing. Years ago, when I was reading MMK's The Far Pavilions, with the cavilling eye I now regret, I came across a passage that struck me forcefully. It was the description of an Anglo-Indian gentleman in the aftermath of an attack in the early days of the 1857 rebellion. He was lying by the roadside, this gentleman, in his Firangi clothes, foreign clothes, dead. His fallen hat is a detail that stays with me. I think it was the first time I realized how Anglo-Indians would have stuck out back then. It was not that I needed reminding that we dressed differently. Even as a boy, I knew we stuck out, or our women did. The problem was that by the time I came across this gentleman, my knowledge of the difference had returned to theory. As a male, I had grown up dressed like everybody else, or rather, like everybody else dressed like me. Every man around me had long ago switched to Western clothes. So I was reading with two sets of partial knowledge. One, that everybody else around the gentleman would have been wearing Indian clothes. And two, that this unfortunate man, who could have been me, was simply wearing what was his usual garb. And I put it to you that, and this is an issue that historians have not addressed, I feel, that of the civilian casualties in 1857, the majority were not British, not English, but Anglo-Indian. Perhaps this gentleman had not, even though he is brought to life by this sympathetic novelist, he had made a mistake. He had paid the price of that choice of headgear. In the popular mind, only foreigners wore hats. for some reason, I see that fallen hat as a Sola Topi. Yet really, the Sola Topi evokes a later generation from the high noon of an empire, some 50 years after the rebellion. But whatever it was, it set you apart from the crowd. In fact, any form of tailored cloth, any tailored clothing would do that, since most people around you wore lengths of untailored cloth, dhotis, saris, turbans. Trousers were rare and would have attracted notice, as would a shirt, and certainly a coat and closed-in shoes. To crown that ensemble with a hat would complete the picture, but in troubled times would not be wise. But did you really have a choice? Mostly you wore what your kin wore and your kind. Muslims wore something from Persia and Araby. Hindus something evolved south of the Himalayas. And Christians, or those with an admixture of foreign blood, something European, or something approximating Europe, since the gesture was what counted. So when trouble came in 1857, Anglo-Indians were simply wearing what they had been for hundreds of years. And this is another realization that has only recently come to me, because when I look at my immediate forebears in this city, for example, right through the 19th century, the Seeleys were a Calcutta family. And it wasn't until the 20th century that we moved to UP and became UP Walas. Of course, now we are Uttarakhandis, of course, living in Dehradun. Even my wife, who is a Kiwi, is and has been for the last 30 years an Uttarakhandi. Now, clothing European, all the same. It matters not. Developing through the 17th century, you have British arriving, Dutch, French, and occasionally their women. By the 18th century, in a city like Calcutta or Madras, one imagines, again, imagination, second-hand shops where Europe cast-offs clothing might be had, allowing further incarnations to be run up with all the chance mutations of style and fabric that adaptation might license. Collar and lapel and cuff, sleeve and neck and hemline, the broad outlines came from Europe. But there would have been some cobbling together of foreign and native styles for much of the period. Cost would always have been a consideration, as well as the availability of materials. Missing a button, you improvised. And buttons were rare in those days. I have a whole novel that hinges on a button, the Tottenham. And where stitchery failed, you simply draped. How strange the first hybrids must have looked as they sought out a fitting style, and how completely the urban scene has changed today when it's the dhotiwala who we notice in the street, at least in the cities. The first military orphanages would have had uniforms for girls as well as boys. There's no light down here, so I have to keep holding up the page, I'm afraid. And orphan brought in would have been fitted out, much as at later boarding schools. For example, the boarding school that I went to in Lucknow, La Martiniere, we had a khaki uniform. These orphans at the Calcutta orphanage, I just spent an hour in the art gallery here, and there is a painting there of the orphanage, as well as another of a sea captain bringing in his orphan son. Neither of these do I remember from my previous visit, which was many, many years ago. So I was very happy that I came a few minutes early and saw that. As the community established a presence, every Anglo-Indian home would have had a handy woman with a talent for sewing. And very soon, supply following demand, there would have been a boxwala. Everybody know what a boxwala is? Not the Calcutta sort of boxwala, the rich toffs who belong to the foreign companies, but the simple boxwala who came around with, on a bicycle with his box of haberdashery. I remember this from all the small towns that I grew up in UP, Bareilly, Saharanpur, Fatehpur, Fatehgarh. I can name them all, Allahabad. There was always a boxwala, and he brought buttons and needles and thread. And soon after this, for example, the European-born wore whatever was in fashion when they left. But here, Darzis promptly copied from these specimens and produced stuff for the Anglo-Indian population here. Zuhur Ali Taylor in Saharanpur duplicated dresses from the Montgomery Ward catalogue for my mother and my sister. Hats were another matter. The Sola Topi, Sola referring not to the sun, but to the reed, whose pith packed the light helmet in the days before styrofoam. The Sola Topi took factory fabrication, but before long it had become essential wear. And the explorer in his white shorts and knee-high stockings and this quixotic crown was already on his way to becoming a cartoon figure. Here was surely something that set you apart in the street. Mad dogs and Englishmen went out in the midday sun, but only the Englishman wore a Sola Topi. And, of course, his shadow in all seasons, the Anglo-Indian. There was a time when Anglo-Indian males wore this topi as a kind of badge of difference and belonging. I don't know who's responsible for this, but thank you, whoever brought it up. And I might pinch it after, if I may. We had one in our house when I was growing up in the 1960s, though I don't remember my father wearing it. I suspect he would have thought it was fuddy-duddy even back then. Whose was it? Where did it come from? It's gone now, that mysterious hat. We've moved house many times, and the piano was a much more important casualty of those moves. I did wear it, but for fun, in front of a mirror, not outdoors, or not beyond the gate. It was khaki, light as a feather, but it made no sense, even to me, 9 years old. Headgear of any sort, except the peak cap of my father's police uniform, was already a thing of the past. Even villagers were putting away their turbans. Today's motorcycle helmet offers a different sort of protection, with a different result: anonymity. The pith helmet, or Sola Topi, didn't hide you, it marked you out. It signaled ruler, or in our case, on the ruler's side. or less blatantly gentlemen. There were one or two cases of non-Anglo-Indian Indians who did wear Sola topis in those days. Westernized, Oriental gentlemen. Do I need to pronounce that word for you? Yes. Wog, that is. The last time I saw one worn was in the early 80s on an elderly gentleman as his rickshaw sailed past our door in Lucknow. This was when my wife and I were in Hazratganj, living there for the 3 years that I was finishing the Trottanama. He was the last of his generation that would have put one on naturally before stepping out into the sun. A La Martiniere boy, perhaps, but from the era when you marched to church in one. Every Sunday we marched to church, there and back twice, but by our time, without hats. But it's got me thinking, the Topi, of our history all over again. How many of us were there, out there, in hats? Women, too, in dresses that set them apart as drastically and at times as fatally as a hat. It was like a caste mark, or rather a mark of castelessness. And inasmuch as castelessness is a good thing, I'd like to think we were instrumental in bringing it about. It has come about just when our numbers as Anglo-Indians are dwindling, or rather, just when Anglos are being submerged in a larger modernity. The new modernizers around us, mostly the young, or those among them who choose to ignore caste, have no idea where their cause and their costume began. They pin it on Gandhi, but it did not begin with Gandhi. It began with the first Topiwalas. Lately, I've been combing the internet, looking for early images of India showing people in hats. My interest is not primarily in fashion, but in race. But race itself, in this case racial mixture, is simply a preliminary to understanding the experience of those early Eurasians. It was an experience of separation to a large extent, of difference, and sometimes rejection, even suppression, of being reminded who or what you were by somebody who was sure he knew. And what was that? Neither one thing nor the other, neither fish nor fowl. That might be an adventure, that racial mixture might be an adventure, was the realization of a much later era. In those days, you would have learnt very quickly to distrust the world's valuation. That you were of the foreigners' party, if a subset of it, that too you would have learnt. And accordingly, you behaved as such in dress and speech and manner. This is how clubs are born. But you were different, local, country-born. This is what they were called, country-borns. Was a descriptive term to start with. A European born here in India. But it very quickly acquired a pejorative edge that reflected the knowledge and the anxiety that the country-born's origins were very likely mixed. The fact that he might be fair-skinned, was no guarantee. It rather added to the anxiety. Look at any photograph of those times. The fact that a person in it might be white doesn't necessarily mean, as you're inclined to imagine, as I'm still inclined to imagine, English or European. In fact, he is just as likely to be an Anglo-Indian. It's taken a while for this penny to drop. Because even when the subject in the picture is quite sure he is English, say a Kipling or a John Masters, the odds are against him. If either of his parents or their parents, and so on all the way back, married in the colony, married a country boy, that is to say a lady as white as a sheet, perhaps, even if they married someone of the colony at home, the gates of chance and history stood open. Genes are tricky things, and race was for a long time a matter of pride and papering over. Today, genome mapping has rendered all those old anxieties pointless. And today, looking to map our past, to calculate our historical numbers as Anglo-Indians, I stumble on a simple demographic tool that might help: the hat. Born into a hatless world, I must clutch at straws the moment I venture beyond what I already know of my family history. But to start with what is known, one of the earliest pictures I have of our family illustrates this quandary. There are two hats in it, on the carpet, in front of two young males, the third and the youngest having evidently not earned his hat. The two hats, Homburgs, from the look of them, they have a curved brim, are set beside my uncles, who look in this photo to be 10 and 12 years old. It's a formal family photo taken outside what looks like the portico of my grandmother's bungalow in Allahabad. And it shows the newly remarried widow, my granny, with her children from her earlier marriage, 6 of them, so 6 and 4, she had 10 children altogether, including the 2 boys with hats. And her new family, who are not Anglo-Indian, AI, but in the old nomenclature, Indian Christian, which used to be abbreviated IC. So you have AI and IC. Confusingly, the ICs, there are 6 of them, in this picture wear Western clothes. The women as well as the men. Later on, these same women will abandon their dresses for saris. One of my aunt's patients, and these were 4 aunts, none of whom married. One became a botanist, one became an educationist, one was a doctor, Aunt Rose. Aunt Patience traveled on the same ship as Gandhi on the way back from England, and met him, had a photograph taken with him, struck up a friendship with his wife that lasted all their life. When they came back, no more dresses, saris. Okay, maybe. I'm not so sure of the political validity of such a gesture. But by a frustrating coincidence, the 2 boys with hats beside them are seated directly in front of the 2 adult males in the picture, my grandfather and his father. So it could be that the boys are simply seated beside the men's hats, ceremonially bestowed on the rug, so that their owner's hands can be free for folding in the lap. Did this great-grandfather a convert? His name was Umaid Rai. When he converted to Christianity, he called himself Uriah Clement. Did he wear a hat in the street? The only other photos that I have of him are studio photos, so I will never know. That's on my mother's side. On my father's side is an equally frustrating family photo. It's been ripped in half so that my grandmother is missing along with her last son but one. All the rest in that family of 10 are present, with the youngest, my father, who died at 89 last year, a baby balanced on his father's lap. That father is hatless here, and I should have liked to question him, but he died when my father was 5. And by the way, I went down the lane, Kenderdine Lane here in Calcutta just yesterday with Keith. Thank you, Keith, for being my guide. To number 22 Kenderdine Lane, where this man was born. And I told you that in the 19th century, the Seeleys were a Calcutta family. This man was born in 1875, and I only learnt about his father by chance. I Googled Seeley, and then I came across this bankruptcy notice. His father had become the one who lived in Kenderdine Lane, a bankrupt, and so his name reached England. And that's why he appears in the newspapers. And then I was able, because he had the first name Charles, and the tradition in this family was always to have the oldest boy named Charles. Not just Charles, but Charles Arundel, double-barrel name. So it's very easy when you're looking at documents to go back through. The man who went bankrupt was born in 1835. You go back to his father, the record is again Charles Arundel, 1798, and then suddenly Charles becomes John. John led me to a famous painting. It's a famous painting by a man called Tilly Kettle. There are Tilly Kettle paintings in here. Please go and see them sometime. Tilly Kettle was a man I used in the Trottonama without ever knowing that he had painted the portraits of 2 brothers Seeley, named Charles and John. So this John is born in 1773. The 2 Seeley brothers, John and Charles, came out to Calcutta and had this portrait painted by Tilly Kettle. It hangs today in London. And the artist himself had an Indian mistress and children by her. Children he acknowledged and loved as much as he loved his wife or his mistress. But neither of the Seeleys seems to have acknowledged his connection. And so that trail that I followed just runs dry. And so in 1773, that's as far back as I can go, once again, paintings helping you with history, but also hindering you. What we need, if we are to trace our history, is not just racial maps, genomic trees, but pictures of the past that show us as we were, as we dressed, as we looked. Sadly, the camera can only carry us back so far, but we must rely on pictures, paintings, engravings. But already, even in the photograph, we are on the road to going wrong. Thinking, for example, that if the person in the picture is light-skinned and European clothed with a Sola Topi, he is European. And if he is dark-skinned and European clothed, he is Anglo-Indian. Not so. The fair-skinned man in the topi and breeches is just as likely to be an Anglo-Indian, since fair skin was always a possibility in a family with a mixed past. What I'm saying is that in any anonymous picture of the Anglo-Indian past, the fair are as much part of the conundrum as the dark. Or rather, the fair one is the conundrum, since the dark one has already declared his hand. Every Anglo-Indian knows this, and almost nobody else. As I approach a history of the Anglo-Indians, I will need technical assistance, a ready demographer, geneticists, but mostly I will want to discover what life was like, everyday life, domestic life in those dark ages of ours. How did it look? How did it feel? I'll go to written sources, of course, but pictures are crucial too, and full of clothes. When clothing speaks, we must listen. But first, we must learn its language. As my mothers used to say, if the cap fits, wear it. My mother was a school teacher. She ended up a principal. Auntie Maureen taught elocution. Auntie Mona was a legendary school teacher in Lucknow. Generations of students. Auntie Joy, my fairy godmother, she started the Yatrik theatre company in Delhi. So these are the women who formed me. She was the secretary of the Shakespeare Society at St. Stephen's, and a whole generation later she made sure that I did that too. She formed the way I think, the way I speak. Now, let me read you a line about Anglo-Indian women. Very quickly, they return to their natural commonplaceness. Women with whom it is impossible to live. Either lifeless wax dolls without a mind, or demons driven by a heady sensuality. Nirad Chaudhary. What exactly? Now, this is in the continent of Circe, and I must confess that the continent of Circe has given me a lot of enjoyment. But when I come across lines like this, I understand what is happening. Here is an autodidact. Here is somebody seeking to parade the knowledge that he has acquired. And I contrast this with the attitude that I spoke of earlier of that researcher, who, after immersing herself in the culture of the people she studied, felt that she had become one of them. When I was at college, we had a guy by the name of Daddy Sharma, who was a Sud, and he used to throw open his windows and play loud classical music. Loud Tchaikovsky would be blaring down the corridors for our benefit, not for Daddy's. And whenever I read The Continent of Circe, I think, loud Tchaikovsky. And if I can pin some of this, not on the fact that he is an autodidact, perhaps on his tribe. The sense that culture is something to be acquired, not something to be lived. This can set you, once you are on that path, you're thinking, the next jump must be higher and higher and higher. And so, every time I speak of this phenomenon, I'm thinking again of this man as the author of the autobiography of an unknown Indian, which I love. And especially the first part of that book, which is so lyrical and so beautiful and such perfect recall of his childhood. And why does that happen? It's because he's writing from the heart. When you write from the heart, you are invincible. But then he grows up, and he begins to write from the head, and he begins to trot out these names, Gibbon, Monson, and he rolls out the heavy armored divisions, and it all goes to pieces. I would just like to use that as an example for those of you who are, and I involve myself in this because I was enamored of critical theory too. Those of you writing today, theory can also lead you into loud Tchaikovsky. Much better to immerse yourself in the lived experience of the people you are studying.
Thank you so much, Alan, for that fascinating, insightful talk. I'm sure you must have many questions for him, and the floor is now open for questions. Please feel free to ask questions. No questions? That looks like the Anglo-Indian resolution to the identity question. A perfect resolution. You have convinced everybody. So, any questions? Yeah, Shomita.
Invention. Is it a British invention? Because a lot of local Saabs, black Saabs are also wearing it. So I just wanted to find out whether it's a British invention, the Sola Topi. Particularly in an ethnic city like Kolkata in India. Was it to ward off the sun?
I think in the age of Google, all of you carrying cell phones should be able to answer that question. Certainly it appears in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, I think. And it's not just India, it's Africa as well. The classic cartoon is of, Dr. Livingston, I presume, and both men are wearing Sola Topis. And very often you have somebody wearing a Sola Topi who ends up in the cooking pot as well, right?
Shomita. Alan, would you like to sit here on stage so that people can see you?
Right, yes. Just get rid of some of these things.
Yes.
Yeah, several actually thoughts going through my head, and I won't sort of do too many of those. Just two. The first, of course, as a historian, the point you made about photographs of pictures and history. And I understand that some of it was to make the point that photographs have not been used enough in history or not to be. And I was just wondering whether one should also sort of take into account how complicated pictures may be in terms of what you read from a picture. And like the example you gave us of that Sola Topi on the carpet, and nobody actually knows who the Sola Topi belongs to. So picture can both give information as well as hide information. So the way in which you read for pictures for history may involve complications. So I'd like you to comment on that. The second, the one I'll sort of ask is the point you made about the white Anglo-Indian being more of a conundrum. And I'll ask this because it's been a thread in the workshop as well in the last 2 days. And I felt it very strongly when Neil read his poetry in the morning. And in one of the poems, he repeated the phrase, just black. And I was wondering that whether if it has to be pure, whether only white is pure. Do you know what I mean? So to be non-white is already not pure. So you can actually only be just white. Everything else is always shades of something or the other. And I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
I remember being in London in the 80s when all the Asians there had begun to describe themselves as black. And this puzzled me. Why not brown? Is a Chinese person in the crowd also to be described as black? Simply because collectively they represent an entity that is not white. I feel that one must distinguish 1,000 shades and give every one of them an equal validity. And that's why I say race, in the case of Anglo-Indians, is not the crucial, the linchpin, as it were. It's culture. What is it that unites them as a cultural group? Language, not color. So any one of these gentlemen in this photograph, I haven't looked at it closely, but at the very first glance, I saw a range of colors. I think I did. Excuse me. Yes, there's a... Well, it's impossible to say now. This could be a group of English people. It could also be a group of white Anglo-Indians. But very likely in a group of 5, at least one of them would be dark. So I really don't know. It doesn't concern me that in one family you have a whole range of color. And this is the point I was making about modernity. Modernity is to look beyond race and to look at the things that unite you. Your earlier question was about the pictures. Yes. There is a photograph of an anonymous group of people, a family. And in the book that I was leafing through at the time, the caption showed, it said that here is a classic case of friendship, even intimacy between the ruling race and the colonized. What it showed was a man in front with his wife, apparently. He has his hand on her lap. He is dark-skinned, she is white. And this photograph had been completely misinterpreted by somebody presumably sitting in London, who was unaware that within one family you could have a dark and a white, and then various, in the progeny, the whole range of colors. So this was taken to mean friendship between the races. This is intimacy. This is a family portrait. So you can misinterpret, as you were saying, and completely get the wrong notion. So when I look at the photograph, I am aware that my interpretation is simply one. I would like to think that one can deduce certain things.
Yeah, first there. Yeah. The gentleman on your left. Yes. Please. Then you.
Sir, our Anglo-Indian people are comfortable in our society now. Most of the time I see they like to migrate in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, like that. Our Anglo-Indian people are comfortable in our society at present because most of the time I saw they are very much interested to migrate in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand.
All the people that I know at home in Dehradun who are eager to migrate are not Anglo-Indians. And the ones who are keenest on this green card in America are not Anglo-Indians. So every Indian that I seem to meet wants his son to go to Australia, and he is either Hindu or Muslim or something else. The Anglo-Indians have already gone. These people are following. Maybe people just want a more comfortable life. I have lived abroad. The comfort factor will only carry you so far.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation and the use of photographs. I think when you're trying to reconstruct, recreate history, textual evidence or any other evidence, architectural evidence is also problematic, and photographs of course have their own problems. Just one thing about the language, because that's one of the main sort of focus of the shared culture, and that being English for the Anglo-Indians. But that has its own problems because there are certain people with European ancestry living in India who might have a different first language. And I'm not talking about the politics of it, but from the point of view of culture, they might still share a lot of this of the culture in terms of religion, habits, and culinary sort of preferences. So is that still a possible discriminatory factor, just sticking to English as the first language?
I think the Constitution defines the Anglo-Indian as somebody with European forebear and makes no mention of language. I've always found that to be problematical. It excludes people, it brings in people who don't belong, and it dumbs down the great differences between the community, within the community. Keith, his second name is Sinclair, so I often think ST and then becomes Steve. Keith becomes Steve. Keith and I are both Anglo-Indians. He is a big city boy. I'm a small town man. There are numerous differences, and yet we have, I can cite a movie, and he will give me an Anglo-Indian response to that movie, which nobody else in the audience will be able to give me. That is what binds us, you know, in spite of all the differences. So, race has nothing to do with it. Once again, in the case of, and this is that blind spot that I spoke of earlier, I carried my research back to the 1770s and no further. I should have gone back into the Portuguese centuries, right? Where the European language in question was not English, but Portuguese. And yet you had a mestizo, a mixed population of 200 years standing, right? So 1773 becomes recent history, right? You have to go back to 1673. You have to go back to 1573, and then you still have to go back another 50 years. And all that time, you have racial mixture occurring, European and Asiatic. And these people then slowly make their way, some of them, to Bengal, and you have a community of Portuguese Indians here who then abandon their language, because by that time the British are masters. So by race, they are Portuguese, or Luso-Indians as they were called. De Rosio, for example, his father is of Portuguese extraction, but he marries an English lady in this city, right? He marries not once, but twice. Both times he marries English lady. So by then you have Portuguese and, say, the Southern European strain entering in the genome map, right? Wipe all that. What's left? They speak in English.
Sir, would you like to comment on the deteriorating population of Anglo-Indians in Kolkata right from the 19th century and so on? If we find, like your forefathers did, they migrated to Uttarakhand.
Yes.
Mr. Bond too.
Yeah.
So would you like to comment on that?
Well, you know, a lot of Bengalis also migrated. You know, in Dehradun, we have a road that is called Bengali Library Road, right? How? All through the 19th century, you have Bengalis who are in the professions. They are either doctors, lawyers, or civil servants. We have lots of Mukhajis, Banerjees in Dehradun, right? So it's not just Anglo-Indians who are going across the country. Anglo-Indians happen to be scattered all over the country for occupational reasons as well, right? So, are you talking about the diminution of the Anglo-Indian population as a whole in this country?
Yeah.
You're talking about the migration away from Calcutta? What are you talking about?
I'm talking about the specific migration of Anglo-Indian population.
Up the Ganga Valley?
From Kolkata, from Calcutta.
From Calcutta
yes.
to other parts of India, or just to northern India?
To other parts of that India, or as such northern India. But if we find our past history of Kolkata,
yes,
we'd find a rich history of Anglo-English people here. But if you consider past 50 years or so, you'll find that the concentration of population moving to northern India or the other places. So would you like to comment on that specifically?
I feel that obviously most people went away, you know, abroad, and that was where the net loss took place. And that 1947 was the first big wave. 1960s was the next. When I, for example, at La Martinida in Lucknow, when I joined the boarding school there in 1960, Anglo-Indians were in a distinct majority in that school. By the time I left, 7 years later, there was just a handful of Anglo-Indians. So where had they gone? They'd all gone away to other countries. Anglo-Indians migrating from Calcutta to Madras, I don't know, or the other way around. I suspect it doesn't happen. The Anglo-Indian culture that I found in Madras had its own unique identity and flavor, and this is quite different. But again, within that overarching umbrella that is Anglo-Indian. I don't know whether I've satisfied you on that, but we can talk about it.
I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on what you said about the lack of a holy book and that being important. I'm also thinking about how in a lot of works, Frank Anthony's Britain's betrayal is often referred to as the Bible of the Anglo-Indian community. I'm just wondering if you have
Bell,
that
book
in
and
mind as
candle.
well.
I don't refer to it as, it's not my Bible.
I know, but it's referred to in a lot of works.
Yes, no, I understand. I'm just being facetious. Just phrase the question once more simply, and I'll...
Just elaborate on what you meant by when you said the lack of a holy book being an important...
I feel very strongly that religion is a binding force in any community. Where we live in Dehradun is the area is known as race course, right? It is also known as a mini Khalistan. Okay, so in front of us we got sstudies. Beside us we got sturdies, and yet we stick out. Yeah? We are the only Christian family there. It's nominally Christian, right? Although, yes, my wife would not say nominally. The Sikhs have this book that has been, some people say, cobbled together, but it is something that holds them together as a community. And they will spill their blood for it. I feel that this is behind the success, the economic success of that community. I feel that unless a community has something that they totally believe in, and which is theirs and theirs alone, they cannot prosper. And I don't mean prosperity just in an economic sense, but to thrive as a community. And this is one reason why we didn't make it. We became dependent, and I don't want to fall into any of the cliches about Anglo-Indians. But we lacked a sense of self-criticism that might have been born out of faith. That faith was diluted because we shared it with people who were not our own kind, who looked down on us. And we were divided in our minds as a consequence. And I feel that that affects every department of your behavior then. I hope I'm not
That's the inner poverty, in my view, and the blind spot of our Anglo-Indian teachers who hold crucial positions to influence something called Anglo-Indian history in Anglo-Indian schools, not there. And it's an enigma. And I know that for the young Anglo-Indians, that if they had a knowledge of their own age without aggrandizement, just a certainty that we know who we are, we have our culture. It's not about race, I totally agree with you. So I won't
Thank you.
say any more than that. Thank you.
I still feel unsatisfied about that, but we'll take it up again. Yeah.
Sir, I just wanted to tell you that how important old pictures are. I was able to dig out some sepia-tinted pictures of my father and his 4 younger brothers. We are not Anglo-Indians. But my father is in his early 20s. He's wearing khaki pants and a coat and a Sola Topi. And if the photograph is taken in Rangoon, because that's where my father went to seek a job when he was about 17 or 18. He's got his 4 younger brothers also brought from Madras across to Rangoon to find a fortune, and that's where they lived till the mid-1930s. And so we find the Sola Topi has probably been asked by the British officer where my father worked to be the kind of a young gentleman coming up in life, to be dressed and attired like that. So it's not necessarily that only the Anglo-Indians copied. And my children found it so much of a kind of surprise when they saw their grandfather being dressed like that, and they said, my gosh, he's really dapper. So it is very strange when a picture like that needn't necessarily represent only Anglo-Indians.
Oh, no, I certainly wasn't claiming the Sola Topi as an item of exclusively Anglo-Indian dress.
My father wore that Sola Topi to go to work as much as recent as the 1950s. I think he gave it up soon after independence. We moved to Bombay from Delhi, and he would go to office, and my younger sister, she just started to speak, and she would wait for my father to pick up his office bag and the hat, and she would say, bag, hat, and oof. The oof was the cigarette that he would light up before. Bag, hat, oof. So, you know, these are memories that goes far back.
Thank you for that. Yes.
I just wanted to add to her memory what is very personal to me. Your fascinating talk reminded me of my grandfather. I have still a couple of pictures, photographs of my grandfather and his friends. He was part of the British bureaucratic system. He was a civil servant in 1920s, 1930s, 40s, in that time. And when he went out to his Himalayan expedition with his friends, and his one of his friends was the famous Bengali novelist Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay, who was himself a schoolmaster, and my grandfather was a civil servant. They were dark-skinned Hindu Bengali gentlemen, and they had these typical pictures of wearing Sola Topi and what do you call the breeches in their mountaineering expedition at that time.
Yes, well, it becomes a badge of being Western, right? They were wearing, what else were they wearing? They were wearing breeches.
Breeches, yeah.
And presumably a jacket. Was there any item of Indian clothing in that ensemble?
No.
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 So they were Westernized Oriental gentlemen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
At the back. At the back.
Mr. Sethi, thank you very much for a beautiful enlightening talk. Actually, I studied from 1958 to 70 in Anglo-Indian School of Calcutta. As you say, well, the boarders were mostly wearing, you know, these khaki shorts.
Yes.
So this is how they were distinguished.
Yes.
So by the time I passed out, their numbers dwindled.
Yes.
As I was saying. But one thing I missed, which I feel my children missed, was the teachers. I really adore them even till today. I'm so old. Still adore them. And I think that my children, they missed the love and the care the teachers put in for us. Even my son was lucky with one or two teachers. So actually, I really sort of, you know, on the Teachers' Day, I really feel very sad. And whenever I visit my school, they are missing.
Yes.
So though it does not connect up with Sola Topi,
No.
but as you said, mentioned that Anglo-Indian they say, so we grew up in that.
Of course.
So I really miss them. I really miss them.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm grateful to my teachers too. I'm grateful to the whole gamut. Mr. Agnihotri was one of my favorites, right? Our Hindi teacher. We called him silver nitrate, huh? AGNO3, huh? Agnihotri. I loved him. Okay? So I loved Frank D'Souza. I loved Mr. Rodriguez, Mr. Shukla. So the whole range, you never forget such people, right? And they came from various backgrounds. Some from Hindi medium, some from English medium. Well, of course, all the Anglo-Indian ones from, and the so-called Goan ones. This Goan business again, you know, nowadays, Goans look at themselves as being separate from Anglo-Indians. In those days, all the teachers with Portuguese names, D'Souza, Rodrigues, they counted themselves as Anglo-Indian. Once again, the question of, you know, language. They had grown up in English-speaking households. They were Anglo-Indian in that sense, right? Even though technically they were Luso-Indians, that is to say, Portuguese Indians. They'd forgotten that. What united all those teachers was their English language.
We'll just take a couple more questions before calling it a night.
So this is in the context of your comment regarding Lamatnia, Lucknow, and Anglo-Indians dwindling there. From Lamatnia, Calcutta, one ex-principal, Colonel Simeon, had settled down in Dehradun, and another teacher who later became principal of St. James, Mr. Mason, he has also settled down.
Yes, I know them both.
You know them both?
I know the son too, Dilip.
So they are in Dehradun. So that's just, I thought...
All sorts of people turn up in Dehradun. We welcome them with open arms.
The last two questions. One here. Yeah. There.
Thank you, sir, so much. I'm an Anglo-Indian. I'm the vicar of St. Paul's Cathedral, and I'd just like to share some of my comments. I don't know if it's a question, but I'm sure you will be able to comment on what I would like to share. Is that when I was in seminary in Bishop's College, Calcutta, I remember in my final year, as often you will have theological debates when you're with your roommates and things. He once, in ignorance, I don't think out of deliberate trying to get at me, said, you Anglo-Indians don't have culture. And
we don't have high culture.
Oh yeah. And he's my colleague today in the Diocese of Calcutta. And I think that got me going with a lot of soul searching. Who am I? Where I come from? What's my identity? Am I half Indian, half Anglo-Indian? All these things that actually came to me, and I actually wrote a thesis which was accepted as a theological thesis to get me a degree for my Bachelor of Divinity. But one of the things that I learned was that sometimes the majority's impression of a minority is always getting the minority to become what they not truly are.
Because we are the other. That's right.
We are the other. And I think for some of the questions of immigration, assimilation, integration, every community is doing that, but it's only when a minority, a mixed race does it, it's stereotyped, misread, misinterpreted, and often misunderstood.
You have to learn to live with it, I'm afraid. All my life I've lived with it. But I refuse this category of the other, because you are other to me. Bear in mind.
There was one more raised hand somewhere here. Is there any more questions? Okay, please. Okay, so those will be the last two questions. First you, and then this lady.
I don't agree with you about the continent of by Niraj Chaudhary. If you go through the book of Cedric Dover, Half Caste,
yes,
he says the urge of purity amongst the impure.
I'm sorry, the what of purity?
The urge of purity.
The urge, okay.
Of purity means the urge of purity amongst the impure. If you can understand that. He is critical of the Anglo-Indian community. And that book was banned by the British government also. And it was only after independence the book was allowed to be circulated.
I know this book.
Yes.
This is the color
Cedric Dover's, but I don't understand the
see,
urge.
It is a very critical statement within the Anglo-Indian community You have heard about Merle Oberon.
Yes, I've heard about her.
Academy Award winner.
Great deal about her. Yes.
She took her mother to New York.
Yes.
Kept her as a maidservant
Yes,
because she was dark-skinned. And she said she was from Tasmania.
That's right.
And she,
in fact, I've written about this very subject in the Trotanama.
Yeah, no,
she appears as Pearl Oberon.
So I'm just, I beg you to differ with you, but in this point, I don't agree with you that within the Anglo-Indian community, all shades and colors are accepted.
No.
The fairer ones identify with the Europeans. And in fact, within the same, amongst the same brothers, it will even say that he is not my brother. Now the same thing has happened with Cecil Dorsey. He went to England, Engelbert Humperdinck I'm talking about. He refused to identify as an Anglo-Indian. And asked by BBC and Channel 4, he said he is from Spain, from some part of Spain, but he is actually from Madras. It's only Cliff Richard who acknowledged he was from Lucknow and then Howrah also for a time. So this difference within the community has been there. Now, one reason was the fairer ones would identify within the community because, as Europeans regarding the pay structure. And the Anglo-Indians would get a lower salary compared to the Europeans in government jobs.
So what's the question? What's the question, please?
The question is, I'm contradicting you that there was a equality within the community of people of different shades and color.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I certainly would not imply that there was not a preference for light skin. It was there throughout the community. If you were light-skinned, you were thought of as beautiful, but you were simply identifying with old prejudices about and old feelings about beauty. So a lot of this has to do not with race, but with class. For example, you talk about higher pay scales for fair-skinned people. So the fair-skinned will try to go for those jobs. And a fair brother might succeed in applying for such a job, and the dark one will fail. There will be resentment between these brothers. These are all perfectly natural human traits.
So, the final question.
So, I know that you said that race is not a factor. Definitely, it's not a unifying factor. Even I do believe that. So, if we try to understand the community, so language is one unifying factor as well as culture. Now the term culture itself is very complicated in nature. Like, what is your take? Like, we cannot probably generalize on culture. So what is your take on what is Anglo-Indian culture? How do you define it, or what do you feel that you feel associated with other Anglo-Indians in terms of culture? How do you?
Well, very often anthropologists say food. You know, if I say dal curry to Keith, he will know what I mean, right? And if I say dal curry to somebody else, he'll say it's not dal curry, it's dal curry. Dal curry unites us, dal curry divides us, right? Beyond that, you know, so you have food, then you have dress, then you have various departments, cultural departments. And in each of these, two people who call themselves Anglo-Indian will find a great deal in common. And there will be those very things that separate them from instinctive understanding of someone who is not an Anglo.
This last thing has triggered off a comment. Yes. Right. What the lady asked there about what is Anglo-Indian culture, and you talked about the food. I personally, with the kind of people that I have mixed with, I feel that music and dancing plays a very important role also in Anglo-Indian culture. In the 60s, you know, the Park Street in Calcutta was agog with that kind of culture, and that slowly disappeared. Now, I am a member of a club here, Dalhousie Institute, where the powers that be are Anglo-Indian. So they have organized something called Friday evenings. And this is a kind of music group that plays, and you will find most of the Anglo-Indians in town coming and converging over there and having a good time dancing because they love doing that, you see. So there
I'm truly not sure that that applies across the board. My father and mother had almost zero interest in dancing. So my auntie Mona and her husband, on the other hand, were great party goers. So you have the same variety of responses across any community. And maybe it was more visible in the case of Anglo-Indians. The girls dressed differently. And so a picture was formed, a stereotypical picture, if you like, that this community behaves in this way, and we, the others, don't. I don't accept that. Maybe the majority did, but think of the minority always, right? Those who didn't conform. And also even the same individual across the years, right? I played the guitar, I sang when I was a student. Today I listen to a different sort of music. I may have danced then, I don't dance now. All of that changes, so it's across time, it's across space. I don't think it's possible to generalize. But I accept what you say, you know, that is what happened on Park Street, say. I know Park Street.
I was curious about something. You mentioned, you talked about a typically Anglo-Indian response to a movie scene. Would you care to give us an example of that?
I'm not sure what I meant at that point. Keith, can you provide some kind of input there?
Anyway.
You know, I'm going to claim, or perhaps hide behind, the notion that there is an intuitive understanding between Anglo-Indians. That sounds like race-based. It's not, it's culture-based. It's, we also have our patois. You know, dry swank is false pride. You say dry swank to one Anglo to the other, he gets it. You know, in India, you also have words that the rest of the world do not understand in English. I'm a teacher, and so if you guys say crib, in the West, crib is cheating.
Yeah.
Over here, it's complaining. So when we talk about these responses, and I was privileged to walk with Alan around the streets of Cal, there's always this intuitive understanding between us as a special language, and our responses, even if we had a delayed response because he's from Dehradun and I'm from Calcutta, within 1 second he got it. And so the funniest thing ever, I was in a bus with a group of Anglos. I've never laughed so much. The jokes were just non-PC. I would never ever say, but I've never cracked up so much with my friends telling stories and parodies. And I think in Bengal you have this lovely word called ada. Ada, I'm not saying it properly, my apologies, but it is that understanding. You know, they say, Masik Garces says that there is a talk between the taxi drivers in Latin America that no one else understands but those taxi drivers. And I'm making a comparison to the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, do you want to? Okay, that will be the final question. Yes.
Well, the Sola Topi was once upon a time, had a status quo, and it belonged to the wealthy urban milieu once upon a time. But it had come and gone. It was a symbol of the British Raj. It had come and gone with the British. Why are we in the present, with the ushering of the new millennium, why are we discussing, or because it has become somewhat of an anachronism, why are we talking about Sola Topi, which has become somewhat of an anachronism with the ushering of the new millennium?
Simply, it's a historical tool. I thought I made that quite clear. Precisely this, that I was trying to determine the number of Anglo-Indians historically at any time. And this shows me that people who were as British in the 19th century could, and very likely were, Anglo-Indian. Because if you look at the demographics, and I'm not a demographer, so I can't, in fact, this is why I would like to speak with somebody, to seek the assistance of someone who can. Because by the early 16th century, you have racial mixture occurring, and the progeny of that not vanishing into the interior, but being classed as they were by the Portuguese, as well as by the British later, as on the ruler's side, but not identical with him. So the numbers of people with mixed blood, even by that century, is phenomenal, even though it doesn't appear at the surface. So that to determine the degree to which racial mixture occurred and the total number of people with mixed blood, here is one way of finding out. And what I'm saying is that in any picture then, it's not necessary that that white man is pure-blooded English. And if he isn't, then you can add that one individual to the total of Anglo-Indians. And this is one way, just one tool. But a demographer would simply use numbers. He would say, right, in this generation you have X number of offspring. They will then marry others. By the next generation, it has exponentially grown. And by the end of the century, it is phenomenal. Imagine then how that is going to be 3 centuries down the line. There will be very few people with pure blood on that ruling side. That's what I was trying to show.
Well, for taking us on a fascinating and insightful journey of the Anglo-Indian identity in particular, but of identities in general, of the necessarily messy, complicated, hybrid nature of identities and the relationships with questions of race and class, the relationships with questions of symbolisms, gestures, visual and other kinds of representations, embellished with fascinating autobiographical vignettes, for honoring us by coming here and taking us on this fascinating journey. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Irwin Allan. And thank you all for coming here. We have tea outside, so we had many questions, very probing, very pertinent questions, and the discussion can go on over tea outside. Thank you so much and good night.